So today we're going to talk about teams, what teams are, and team development interventions in organizational development. And I wanted to start with the open systems model again because we often think of this model broadly as a model to help communicate and to understand how organizations function. And I primarily use it as a diagnostic tool. So when an organization is in distress, they realize something needs to be done. They usually have a good idea, but I do like to kind of go through a kind of meta level of what are the inputs and is the company getting what it needs, and that includes resources such as human resources. Is the company actually putting out positive outputs? Is that actual the results that get the organization towards its goals solid? Is there major changes in the environment that are impacting the organization? And then what are the processes within the organization that changes inputs to outputs? And finally, what communication is occurring as far as recognizing what is needed to create good outputs is also being fed back into how inputs are being brought into the organization. And generally, we find a lot of times that the problems that we address with organizational development interventions is focused on process. And indeed, most team intervention processes are going to be on that level. But I think this is also an interesting model to use even in the micro level. So for example, a team. So we can use open systems to ask, what resources are being brought in? So what are the inputs of the team? How does the team function? What are the team's goals, or what is the team supposed to produce? How does that team exist in the environment with other teams and other parts of the organization? And finally, how is communication handled, the feedback within that team? So I really wanted to just kind of touch base on this again because I think this really is one of the bedrock foundations of the idea of organizational development, really just conceptualizing how organizations work. But this same model can really help us anytime we're looking at any subcomponent within an organization and how it functions. We're going to be looking at the same things. What's the environment? What's the process? What's the inputs, the outputs, the goals? And again, that feedback and communication. So we're going to look at team development interventions, and the first thing we're going to talk about is exactly what is a team, what defines a team versus just a group, and I'm going to try to do that in the next couple slides. And we're also going to, I've got the cartoon here. Before we get going, I'd like to start with a quick pack building exercise. A lot of our interventions, when we're looking at teams, it depends on what's happening with the team, but the most common problem in a team is open communication and open decision making. So usually it's not necessarily a problem of the inputs, who's been put on the team. It's usually less of a problem with the outputs, the intended goal of the team. Sometimes the interventions may be external, the environment, the organization itself is not supporting the team. Sometimes it may be just a communication issue, but more often than not, it actually is the process of how the team shares its skills, its information, shares work, and shares decision making. And therefore, a lot of the interventions are going to be kind of focused on helping people socially interact within that team. So I myself tend to make light of, basically pack building exercises. But a lot of times that is what's actually going to be necessary to make sure a team that is functioning suboptimally or below its capacity is actually brought up to speed, because a lot of times that's where the problem is actually occurring in that process. So what exactly is a team? A team is a group of individuals, and before we even start talking about specifically the definition or what defines a team, I want to talk a little bit about groups in general. There's an enormous amount of social science research, mainly looking at group process, that's kind of found four broad categories of groups. And this is kind of my conceptualization of it. The first one is the individual. So when we're talking about social psychology, when we're talking about personality psychology, we're generally talking about how an individual interacts with their environment, their social environment, other people, but it's usually focused on them not collaborating with those other people. It's how does their individual efforts, their individual behaviors result in changes in their behavior based on the people they're around. Then we have dyads. Dyads are when we have two people that are dependent on each other and working together. And we generally find that the dynamics of how communication occurs, how job sharing or work is shared, how decision making is done, is pretty different when you only have two people compared to three or more. So when we're talking about teams or groups, generally we're looking at research and what we know about a group of three or more people. And that's what we're going to focus on these interventions. Now, at a certain point, a team or a group, as it gathers more and more members, hits a kind of critical mass where it starts to become hard to actually manage these dynamic processes. And that usually happens somewhere over 7 or 8 individuals. And again, if you look at cognitive psychology, we know that our processing of our memory, so our cognitive processing goes through kind of 3 main forms. We have short-term memory and we have long-term memory. And when we look at kind of the process of gathering information from our environment, sensory memory, then the short-term memory where we actually are thinking about it actively, compared to long-term memory where we've stored that information for later retrieval. Through that process, we know that we gather an enormous amount of information in sensory memory. We can store an amazing amount of information in long-term memory, but our short-term memory, that processing area, has actually a limit of kind of ±2 around the number 7. So most people can kind of keep 7 concepts at once functional in their short-term memory, their processing space. And this is kind of interesting because that number 7 shows up in a lot of places in psychology, and one of the places it shows up is group process. When we actually exceed more than 7 people in a group, we notice that the dynamics start to change. Communication between all 8, 9, 10 or more people starts to break down to a certain degree. Decision making starts to become a little more complex, and most of the interventions we're going to talk about here are more challenging when you have more than 7 people in your group. You can even see this effect if you go to a party. You'll notice that basically the more people are at the party, the more groups you're going to see start to form up and have conversations. And start just taking a look at those groups. And what you're going to see is you're going to see some dyads. You're going to see 2 people. You're going to see groups of 3, groups of 4, groups of 5, less groups of 6, less groups of 7, and very rarely are you going to see a group of over 7 unless there's one very dynamic individual kind of lecturing. And again, that's no longer a conversation, that's now someone addressing a group. So when I talk about teams, I'm usually thinking of about 3 to 7 people. And this may be one of the very first diagnostics you do when you're actually looking at teams. What's the size of the teams that you're being asked to evaluate? So a team also has complementary skills. The entire purpose of putting together a team is that you have different people with different sets of skills. So again, if you have 5 individuals in an organization with all the exactly same skills, there's almost no variance in what they do. This may be more like a work group, a group of people that are individually doing tasks that get together for social reasons. So if we're actually talking about a team, we're expecting to see people with different but complementary skills on that team that are helping each other. So each person is providing information about their skill area to inform other people to use their skill areas even better. The second factor of how we define a team is it's dependent on one another to accomplish a common purpose. So again, we'd call it a work group if you have 6 people that are together. They're all engineers, they're all working on individual projects, and they may talk a little bit with each other to get ideas, but for the most part, they could easily complete their tasks without ever actually having to access the skills of anyone else in that group. Again, I would argue that's not a work team, that's a work group. So again, is the team actually dependent on others to accomplish the common purpose? If you removed certain members of the team, would their performance be reduced or their output not as good? And finally, a team should hold themselves mutually accountable. So not only do they have complementary skills, not only are they dependent on each other to accomplish the actual goals of the group or team, but they also are mutually accountable for the success. So again, if you have a situation where people can basically clock out, not do work, and the team will still function, that means they didn't have a set of skills that were complementary and needed. They weren't actually dependent on others for the other people to accomplish the goals. And when the goals were accomplished, they weren't accountable for not helping. So this is our very first, outside of the definition of what is a team, this is our first set of 3 questions to ask when we're looking at the function of a team. Is the actual structure of the team conducive to it actually functioning well as a team? And that might be the first area for an intervention, is how do we actually readjust the composition of the team to make sure there's complementary skills? How do we restructure the task the team is being given to make sure that the team itself has to work on each other and depend on each other in order to complete that task? And finally, how do we make sure that the team itself is holding each person accountable for the work they need to do? So teamwork is work done when members subordinate personal prominence for the team. So again, we should see teamwork when people are willing to basically share what they're doing and share their expertise for the benefit of the team more than the benefit for themselves. And this is, again, human nature. We're political animals. We're always kind of thinking about what's good for us, excuse me, what's good for our careers, what's going to make us look better. We do need to make sure that that doesn't become the preeminent purpose of each person on the team, because that will, again, subvert teamwork. And finally, we really need to focus on interdependence. One person's performance should be contingent upon how someone else performs. If we don't have interdependence of performance within a team, again, we're looking at more like a work group than an actual team. Team building is probably one of the most used interventions in organizational development. And team building is also often referred to as team development. The terms are used somewhat interchangeably. Team building generally is focused on members examining the goals and culture of the team. So are those goals conducive to that interdependence? Are those goals conducive to actually resulting in people actually being mutually accountable for the success of the team? And then what's the culture or the actual structure and norms of the team? And is it helping the team function, or is it actually hindering the team to function? The objective is to improve the ability to work together, and often these team building exercises are really focused on communication and decision making, and also making sure that structure is there that's going to make it more likely that a team is going to be successful. So the need for team development, teams are becoming the primary unit in most organizations, and this is primarily functioning because organizations have realized that there's a lot of just automatic benefits from forming teams. The first thing is it opens up lines of communication between experts and employees which have various skill sets. It allows people to be more invested and feel more actual engagement in their work. It's a major tool for actually kind of providing additional decision making at lower levels. So all of these are seen as very positive units, and a lot of organizations have moved towards teams. The problem is once that initial move is made, we now have to go into each team and see, is it actually functioning in a way that we're hoping that it functions? Generally speaking, there's two types of teams: natural work teams and temporary task teams. And really this just as a question of what is the life cycle or expected life cycle of the team. A natural work team is a group of people that are going to be working together long term on multiple projects and are probably going to get to know each other very, very well. And this can be both a benefit long term, but there also is some long term additional challenges that can affect a natural work team. A temporary task team is usually a group of people that are brought together to actually perform one particular task. And once that task is done, they very well may have that team broken up and assigned to new teams. So the needs for team development does vary with the situation. And one of the first questions you want to ask is this an existing team, a natural work team that is going to be working together for a long period of time? Or are we looking at kind of a short-term team that we're needing to kind of fast track getting them to work well together? So a way to conceptualize what type of problems are involved with teamwork interventions, we really kind of want to, again, think about this conceptually. And one of the things is that there's kind of two factors that we can use to determine what kind of problems may be occurring in a team: the level of sharing required for the task and the complexity of the situation. So basically, simple situations, actions are fairly highly certain, and thereby their nature also, the need for communication is fairly low. And if there's problems occurring at this level, they're usually technical issues. They may be a slight tweak in personal and social skills. It may just simply be how often the team is meeting or how communication occurs when the team is not physically present with each other. As we move to more complex situations, usually the amount of sharing is increased. So cooperation and negotiation is important. There's political give and take, listening, persuasion, and sharing skills. And as we hit more complex situations that the team is supposed to deal with, the need for information sharing is naturally increasing, and therefore, generally speaking, we're going to focus on teaching cooperation and negotiation skills, how to communicate properly, how to make proper decisions. Now, as the problems become even more complex, and these problems are what the team is actually supposed to deal with, so what are the actual outcomes or goals of the team? As actions become highly uncertain, how are we going to handle this challenge? How are we going to create this new product? How are we going to handle this new challenge? teamwork skills become incredibly important because the level of sharing to do well in an uncertain problem is extremely high. And that's when we're usually going to mainly focus at the highest levels of interpersonal skills to really make sure that nothing is blocking the communication and decision-making advantages that we find in teams. So again, a diagnostic model of just looking for sources of teams' problems. These can be everything from looking at the goals that the team has set, how the members are actually, what the members need from the team. Are they getting what they're needing, both task focused wise? Are they getting resources to get the parts of the job done that they need to do? But are they also getting their social needs met? The norms of the group, are the norms actually supporting positive team function, or are they actually hindering positive team function? It's possibly the team makeup, so homogeneous members. Too many people have the same skill sets, which means there's a lot of redundancy, and with redundancy, you start to also run into a situation where it's going to be hard to build that interdependence. How's decision making being handled? Is it being handled in a very directive or dictatorial way, which is going to naturally kind of dull some of the communication and advantages of teams? Or is it being done collaboratively? How is leadership being handled? And every group of people is going to have, at minimum, informal leaders, people that tend to take charge. I tend to often fall into kind of the task-focused role whenever I'm on a team. I'm currently on a virtual team, so this is 5 people working together on a fairly large project. We're revising an entire website for an organization. We've never met in person. It's all been done either through internet, chat rooms, or Skype calls. But the leadership is technically the official leader of this group is the person actually doing the coding, because whatever we come up with, that's the person that has to actually put it into practice. So we all decided it made most sense for him to have the official leadership role. But almost every meeting that we have, he kind of just says, okay, what needs to be done, and is very passive. And it's usually me that's actually going, okay, we've got 3 main things we need to accomplish here. Let's talk about this. And it's usually me, the one that's going, okay, does anyone else have any questions? So I'm kind of taking on that informal leadership role in that particular situation. So that can be, in that particular group, I think it's working very well. But if the actual assigned leader was really someone that was taking charge and I was still trying to take an informal leadership position, there might be a lot of political strife right there. There might be a lot of basically problems within the group as we kind of fight for that leadership role. So looking to see how leadership is being done, and is it being done in an efficient way? And like I said, the size of the group. One of the first things we can really look at is, do we have an optimal size that is what's necessary? Now, I talked about that idea of 5 to 7. There are going to be some teams that have to be bigger. So there are certain teams that just the number of skill sets that are needed to be brought into one room may exceed 7. Just recognize that we don't want to increase over that number unless we have to structurally to get the job done. I want to talk a little bit about the idea of, as we build up groups, as groups have worked together more, when we're successful at team building, one of the things we're trying to build is cohesiveness, the unity that members of the groups have for one another and for the team. We're trying to actually build that kind of social aspect that people are proud of the team that they're on. They care about the other people on the team. They feel invested. They feel a cohesiveness, that this is a part of who they are. I'm a member of Work Group 7, for example. The one thing we do need to work on and basically keep an eye out for, though, is that in teams that have existed for a long period of time that have high cohesiveness, cohesiveness can become a problem. So a high degree of cohesiveness can result in a situation that's been dubbed groupthink. And the idea of groupthink is that you've become so cohesive and that people are so invested in being a member of this team that can be used against them to keep them from sharing information that they think may not go over well with the team. Remember, we're wanting to keep those lines of communication open. We want everyone to feel like they're involved in decision making, but we also need to be aware that as you build cohesiveness, you start to get to a situation, you could get to a situation of groupthink. And when we see groupthink, we see a deterioration of reality testing. So the organization is no longer, the team in this case, is no longer actually really caring about outside data. They start to think, we know what we're doing, we don't need exterior information. It tends to create a situation of group pressure. In other words, we see the actual team itself starts to create a norm that disagreement is not accepted. It's likely to happen when agreement becomes the dominant force in the group. So the norm is that we need to all be on the same team. We need to be together on this. And that starts to become a pretty powerful force to stop people from bringing up their own doubts, their own problems with what's happening. And a good part of team decision making is allowing that process to occur. So it also tends to outweigh considerations of alternatives. Usually when we see cohesiveness at a very high level where it starts to become groupthink, teams tend to make decisions very quickly. The decision-making process of a team should take some time. It should take more time than just having a manager make a quick decision. That's a part of the advantage of having a team. So 8 characteristics to look for to see if a team is moving towards groupthink. Illusion of invulnerability, so a belief that the team cannot actually make a bad decision, the belief that the team will always be successful. Rationalization, so basically if there's external information that is actually challenging that illusion of invulnerability, is it examined or are rationalizations created of why that information is incorrect? There's also an illusion of morality. This basically means the group starts to think of itself as better than all other groups. Now, that's a natural human tendency. We always tend to think that the groups we belong to are a little bit better than other groups, but the illusion of morality is getting to where it's actually starting to become a bit of a toxic situation, where there really is some arrogance in this particular group. The group starts to create its own stereotypes about the people that are not in the group, so you start to hear kind of negative phrases used for other teams or other groups. There's a lot of direct pressure in the norms of the group to dissuade communication and to dissuade disagreement. And we also see a fair amount of self-censorship. That's individuals thinking to themselves, I don't think this is the greatest idea, but never actually being willing to share it. And that creates an illusion of basically unanimity. Everyone is basically thinking that everyone else must agree. In other words, every single person in the group is self-censoring, but everyone else is also thinking, I'm the only one self-censoring. Everyone else is agreeing with this. I'm the only one that isn't, so I better not talk up. And finally, probably the easiest to identify is mind guards. A mind guard refers to someone that is not in direct leadership position, but has become kind of the second to the leader, and you now have to talk to that person, not the leader, to get information to the leader. When someone gets to start to decide what information makes it to the leader of a team and what information doesn't, that by its very nature is a major red flag that the advantages of a team are disappearing, and you've probably got a group that is now so cohesive that they're willing to put up with this, and that is groupthink.